Welcome everyone to this live webinar with Dr. Sean Brady. Sean's a forensic engineer who works with businesses and government and the legal sector to understand and resolve complex issues that typically require a whole of system approach. Sean has just completed the Brady Review, an investigation into the causes of fatalities in the mining industry in Queensland, Australia. This review analysed 20 years of incident and fatality information and was data driven and culminated in 11 recommendations for both industry and the regulator on how to lower the fatality and incident rate. Sean speaks, podcasts and writes about failure, human behaviour, data analytics and engineering disasters. He has also acted as an expert witness on numerous occasions. I'm Herman Fashing, the Chief Inspector of Mines for Mineral Mines and Quarries, and I'm the host and the chair for this session. For those of you that are interested and keen, there will be a question time and we'll open up the questions once Sean starts his presentation, and you'll see a section on your screen where you can type in the questions and then we can read those out in question time. Now, originally, the Inspectorate had intended for Sean to present this presentation in person at a number of workshops, conferences and seminars. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic meant that we couldn't do that. However, the Inspectorate considers it is still very important to get the information and the recommendations from the Brady report out to industry and for people to have the opportunity to ask those questions and to understand those recommendations and what they mean. For those of you that don't know, so the background to that review was that on the 8th of July in 2019, the Honourable Dr. Anthony Lynham, the Minister for Natural Resources, Mines and Energy, announced an expert review would be undertaken to identify changes needed to improve the health and safety in Queensland mines and quarries. Now, that announcement was made following a fatality on the 7th of July 2019, which followed a total of 5 fatalities in the 2018 financial year. Now, with regards to that review, the Minister's requirements were to examine all fatal accidents in Queensland mines and quarries from 2000 to 2019, and based on this examination, look at 3 key factors: why mine workers had died over the last 20 years, how industry can improve, and how the Mines Inspectorate can work better. So that's the context and the situation in relation to the report. I'd now like to hand over to Sean for his presentation.
Hello everyone. We're going to talk about some aspects of the Brady Review today. The reality is, if we tried to talk about all the aspects of this, we'd be here for a couple of days. So what we're going to do is talk about 2 particular pieces related to high reliability organizations, and I'm only going to talk for about 25 minutes to 30 minutes, and that gives us plenty of time for questions after that. I'm happy to take questions on anything we present or any other aspects of the review either. So a little bit of an overview before we start of what the review really was about. If you want to read the report, it's available on the Queensland Government website. You can just Google Brady Fatality Report and you should get that link. It's also available on our website, and you may want to have a look at this as we talk. I'll reference a few pages as we go through it, so feel free to pull that up if you want. The review itself was looking at fatalities from January 2000 to the end of July 2019, so almost a 20-year period. There were 47 fatalities in that period, and we broke them down and tried to understand the causes of each of those and tried to find the common causes or the common drivers that cause these fatalities in the mining industry. So that was one of the aspects of the review. The other aspects of the review was to look at all the incident data that the regulator received. So this is in the form of the high potential incident data, the serious accident data, the lost time injury data that is submitted to the regulator when there is incidents. And we looked at that because we wanted to put context around the fatalities and understand how the incident reporting was working. We also looked at all the hours worked. So we had the hours worked per mine per month for the industry for the entire time period. And this allowed us to look at serious accident rates, HPI rates for different mines and even for different sectors of the industry as well. There was a lot of discussions, and there was some mine visits in there as well to understand what I suppose all of you believe is important in terms of what drives fatalities and how we can make that better. And finally, there was a call for submissions. So we put out a call for submissions, and we received a submission back from the Mine Managers Association, which was great to get. Now, as we go through this, I want you to think about a couple of questions, and feel free to jot them down, jot down some of your answers now, and we'll come back to them as we go through the presentation. The first one is, I want you to think about what you believe causes accidents and fatalities. What do you think is the key things that causes these sorts of tragedies to take place? And I also want you to think about, what do you believe is the most common kind of control that's implemented following an incident? So there's been an incident, need to put a control in place to prevent that happening again. What is the most common kind? I suspect there'll be a big variety of answers to question one, but I suspect we'll have a very small variety of answers when we get to controls put in place after an incident. So keep those in mind, and we'll jump in to the report really at the end. And one of the key recommendations is that the industry start to adopt some of the behaviors and the techniques of high reliability organizations. I think this is probably the single most important thing you can do, one of the most important things it can do to reduce the fatality rate and the serious accident rate. What are high reliability organizations? Well, the answer is it's actually quite difficult to get a definition that everyone agrees on, but fundamentally it is organizations that experience very few disasters or failures despite having activities they need to conduct that are complex and hazardous. Now, the classic sort of example that's floated all the time with a high reliability organization is, airline travel. If you think of how many planes are usually in the sky at any one time, and all the hazards they face, both with individual planes and the interaction of lots of planes at airports, there are very few crashes, and that really is the core center of this concept of the high reliability organization. And we find air traffic control is the same as well. So the interesting thing then is, you say, well, what makes these organizations high reliability organizations? What makes them different to other organizations? Well, all the research that's been done says there's really 5 things that set a high reliability organization apart from other organizations, and we'll go through the 5 of them, and then we're going to concentrate on just 2 of them in this review. So the first of these is that high reliability organizations have a preoccupation or an obsession with failures rather than successes. They're always trying to understand what's going wrong, where things are going wrong, even really small things. And what they're doing is they're doing this, that by collecting this information, analyzing this information, they are going to use that to understand where the big risks are, where the big risks are coming from, where the big failures are coming from. So that's the first one. We'll come back to that later on in the presentation. The second one is there's a reluctance to simplify interpretations. High reliability organizations don't sort of accept the first logical cause of an issue that they come across. They drill down and they try and understand, well, is there any other causes? And what they're really after there is they're after organizational causes. And a really good, simplified interpretation that we see in a lot of industries, and we certainly see it in the mining industry as well, is people can blame human error. And how big a problem is human error? And that is a classic simplified interpretation. If your go-to place is human error as the cause of incidents, then, well, hopefully we'll challenge that a little bit today. The third thing that high reliability organizations do is they have a sensitivity to operations. They're very concerned about understanding what's happening at the front line, at the coalface where things are taking place. And they're always trying to ensure that their understanding of what's happening at the coalface is actually what's happening at the coalface. It's not a matter of just writing procedures and sending them down the line and expecting them to be followed. There's a constant evaluation of what's actually taking place, and they're really big on things like avoiding siloing, where people know what they know about the piece of the operation, because of course what that does is that blinds people to the interconnectedness of the organization they're working in. So that's sensitivity to operations. Commitment to resilience. This is one of the interesting things. HROs expect things to go wrong. They know things are going to go wrong. They know humans are fallible and they're going to make mistakes. And as well as trying to prevent that happening, what goes hand in hand with that knowledge that humans will make mistakes is that you have to recover really quickly. So that's where the commitment to resilience comes in. Yes, things will happen that will be not good, there'll be negative events, but how do we recover very quickly from them to minimize any damage they will do? So very different from saying that here are our procedures and we know if we follow these procedures nothing bad will happen. It's very much about how do we recover quickly. And the last one is deference to expertise. Make sure that the people who are making the decisions are at the levels in the organization are the best people to be making those decisions, that you don't have too many decisions coming up from the bottom or too many decisions coming down from the top, that there's the decisions sit in the correct place in the organization where they need to sit. So that's the 5 of them, and that's what makes HROs different, and I believe that's the direction the mining industry has to go to improve things. We're going to talk about 2 of them, the first 2, and we'll start with the second one, which is the reluctance to simplify interpretations. And when we're doing this, I want you to have a think about the Queensland mining industry and ask yourself, do you believe the industry takes very simplified interpretations of what goes wrong, or is it driven to understand why negative events have happened? One of the best places I think to start with this is to actually start with the fatalities themselves. A few things about this. I've written the word superficial up there. You know, if you do a superficial examination of the causes of the 47 fatalities, it's very easy to come away with a certain view of what has happened. Now, there are a few reasons for this. One is that the nature and cause reports typically produced by the regulator haven't been released, so most of them haven't been released, so there's a lot of speculation out there in the industry of what actually goes wrong in these fatalities. And the other bit is that the department provides some information on the website, and when you go through this, I just want to read out sort of 3 or 4 of these for you so you get an idea of what caused these fatalities. And I will obviously put a warning here that we are talking about fatalities. These are real people, so what we're about to talk about will be distressing. But if we take 4 of them, the description of the incident is, fatality injured when he fell into an ore pass. Fatality injured when he was struck by a pump being lifted out of a sump by a mobile crane. Fatality injured when he was run over by a front end loader. Fatality injured after becoming entangled in a conveyor. Now, when you read this, and this is what I mean by a superficial reading, it's very easy to come away with a feeling that these are freak accidents. These sort of things almost can't be prevented. How do you prevent some of those taking place? And this can lead to what I talk a lot in the report of a sort of fatalism. This, which I found in many discussions with many people at all levels in the industry, there is certainly a fatalism in my mind in the Queensland mining industry. There's a belief that it's simply not possible to mine without hurting people every now and again, and that people will die because of these sort of freak accidents. And when you read what I've just read you come away with that reinforced. And I think I want to challenge that. This is the first sort of key thing I want to do, because these are the simplified interpretations we get of the fatalities. So what we did in the review was we created a range of what we call causal diagrams. And this, I don't expect you to read this for the moment, it's an example more so than anything else, but what this is a breakdown of the causal chains that took place in one of the fatalities. And we produced one of these for all 47 of the fatalities. Now, the advantage you have of this is you're able to represent a lot of information from the nature and cause reports. These are based directly on the nature and cause reports from the regulator. You're able to represent a lot of information on just one page. So we had 47 fatalities and we end up with 47 pages, which allow us to look at similarities across the incidents to see if there's common causes, if there's common trends that we see. We have published 41 of the 47 of these in the report. They're on pages 92 to 132 of the report. I would say to you that if you read nothing else of the report, go to those pages and look through that. They are distressing reading. They're very confronting, but I would suggest that they will challenge what you think are the causes of fatalities in the industry. And a few things about them, we'll get into a little more detail in a second, but a few things if you flick through them is you'll see that there are many causal chains. And the one we have here, there's lots of boxes, lots of events that had to come together for a fatality to occur. And we see that again and again and again. This is combinations of many factors. Now, you can go and have a look at the causal diagrams yourself. In terms of a summary, what you find overwhelmingly is that these are, a combination of very, banal, everyday, straightforward factors. There tends not to be big smoking guns in these fatalities, and usually it's a failure of controls, lack of training, or absent or inadequate supervision. Now, I think the key here is that when you read these, you find these were not freak accidents. You find that a lot of things had to come together to produce a situation where someone got killed. You needed controls that weren't working. You needed supervisory problems. You need someone not trained to be in a situation where they couldn't protect themselves. And this, I think, is an uncomfortable finding. I think we, as human beings, want to believe that big events have big causes. And when you look through the causal diagrams, you'll see that that is simply not the case. This is everyday stuff that is resulting in fatalities. And if we want to break this down even further, and this is all in the report, obviously, but a few areas are worth talking about. One of them is human error. Many of the failures or the fatalities did have human error involved with them, but very rarely was it the sole cause. You needed human error in combination with failed controls or training issues or a whole range of things. And we found that even in 17 of the 47 cases, there was no human error on the part of the deceased at all. So the person who got killed was not doing anything wrong. And we'll come back to human error as we talk through this. But if you think human error is the biggest problem, that is not what you'll see if you go to the causal diagrams. You need it in combination with other things. Lack of specific training was a big one. So 17 of the 47 fatalities, there was a lack of specific training, either related to what the area of the mine the person was in when the incident happened, or the piece of equipment that the miner was using when the incident happened. So we're talking about very specific training here, not general mine training, but very specific for the task or the place where the individual was. In addition to that 17, there was a further 9 who had inadequate training. So of the 17, there was no training involved in the specific task they were doing or where they were, but there was a further 9 where we had inadequate training, where the training just wasn't good enough to protect the person. One of the biggies was supervision. So we worked through the 47 fatalities, and in our view, 32 of them were doing tasks that required supervision. And we found that in 25 of the 32 of those cases, there was inadequate supervision. Or it was absent. That was the other one as well. But that's a very high number. And it's showing that the role of supervision is incredibly important. And I'm using the word supervision there, not supervisors. I'm not saying the problem is supervisors. This is a supervision problem, and we should treat it like that. Of course, the supervision problem exacerbates other problems. If the supervision is not what it needs to be, then things like inadequate training become big issues, much bigger than before. In addition to that, we've got controls. Almost all the failures had controls that were ineffective or absent. So that was a really important finding. And one of the things I would say to people is, if you want to do something right now in your mines, go out and find out who's doing something they're not trained to do, find out where you've got your supervision gaps, and test your controls. Figure out whether you've got your controls in place. Many of the fatalities had a control that wasn't effective, and if it had been effective, then the fatality would have likely been avoided. And we're talking complicated and simple controls here, right down to the level of seat belts that played a role as well. 10 of the fatalities involved known faults, and this is where you get back to this hazard identification problem. These were known issues, but despite that, people ignored the risk. One of the classic ones that we found was a truck with problems with the brakes, and many people knew there was a problem with the brakes. Even the driver who drove the truck and was involved in the incident knew there was a problem with the brakes. And there had even been a near miss the day before with the same truck, and it was related to braking. So that, I think, is very important as well. We know what is going wrong out there in some of these cases, but some of it is we're just not catching it before it does damage. This is an interesting one, drugs and alcohol. Only 3 of the 47 involved drugs and alcohol. And I think drugs and alcohol is up there with that human error one for me, that it's very important clearly to avoiding incidents, but that is not the key issue in the 47 that we looked at here. Now, why talk about these from the perspective of the HROs? Well, at the beginning, one of your questions was, what do you think causes fatalities? And what I notice when I'm talking to people is that they can cherry pick from this list. They can say supervision is the issue as far as I'm concerned, or training is the issue as far as I'm concerned. And the reality is it's a collection of all these things, of which human error is not the most important. And this is really this concept that is very important about the HROs. There is a reluctance to simplify interpretations. So in a HRO, you try and avoid bundling things into human error or maintenance failings. You try and look at the context and the contingencies that happened around each event. And it's interesting, sometimes I think ICAMS falls short of this. You don't sometimes get to the level you need to get to understand what was the key driver behind the situation on the ground. Was it funding to do things? What was it? You need to get right back to that fundamental driver level of understanding what's happening. So that would be one of the key things in terms of this particular recommendation for HROs, and this particular aspect of HROs, is remove the concept of bad luck from your head and freak accidents and human error, and go and try and find the underlying system failures. One of the key things that you're really trying to do here is you're trying to identify in these investigations what were the controls that failed. And I would say to you, if you go back to your organization and you look at your own internal investigations, and if you find that a large percentage of them have human error as the cause, you may not be catching the system and organizational causes of the incidents. And if you don't catch the system and organizational causes, then what happens is you end up in a situation where another person can be in a similar situation again, and you'll have the same incident because you haven't actually dealt with the fundamental issues in the organization. So that's that piece. The second aspect of HROs we want to talk about is the preoccupation with failures rather than successes. This is an interesting one, and again, I would say to you is, do you believe in your organization there is a preoccupation with trying to find the failures, all the failures, not just the big ones, but the little ones, and try and deal with them and prevent them causing a big one? What we find central to the HROs is the ability to spot the problem which is really what you're using your reporting for, and then put an effective control in to make sure you don't have a problem. So it's closing that loop is really what's key about this point. And HROs, know this. They know that basically anything happening that is off normal is of interest. You follow it up and you try and understand what is driving this particular thing, and have you got something that will erupt on you, blow up on you later on, and cause a lot more damage. So this is all about picking up on the warnings, understanding what those warnings mean, and then act on them, usually in the form of a control, to avert disaster. Now, hold that thought for a moment. What we're going to do is have a quick look at the serious accidents, and the serious accidents are the accidents where someone is required to be admitted to hospital for treatment for that particular incident. And if we look at the causes of the serious accidents, and this is for the period of the review, you find a number of interesting things. You find in 36% of the cases, the hazard that caused the incident hadn't been identified. So that's the first category that's big. You'll notice the second category that's big at 45% is that the hazard was identified, but the control was ineffective. Now, if you think back to your HROs here, it's all about identifying the hazards and getting the effective control put in place. What we're seeing causing the accidents is saying that that's potentially not happening as well as it needs to happen. What we're seeing here is that, in almost half the cases, the accident isn't being, or the hazard isn't being identified, and in the other half, the control that was put in place is ineffective. And we can look at this over time. You'll notice the 2019-20 data is small. That's only because we only have July for that financial year. But you can see that the number of serious accidents is increasing from 2015-16 onwards, and our two major causes, either the hazard not been identified or the hazard being identified but ineffective control, are increasing together. So we're, as an industry, we're missing some of the hazards, and we're putting in some controls that are ineffective. Now, why are these controls ineffective, or what can we learn from the data to help us understand that a little bit? Well, when we have incidents and they're reported to the department, it's also reported the type of control that's put in place, and usually it's one of the usual controls: elimination, substitution, isolation, engineering, administrative, PPE, all the controls that you'd be very, very familiar with. And what we did as part of the review was we looked at, well, what is the percentage of these controls put in place after certain accidents, let's say the serious accidents. And that's why I said at the beginning, which do you reckon is the most commonly used control after an incident has happened? And this was interesting. No matter who I talked to in the mining industry, they all replied without hesitation that it was administrative controls. And when we crunched the numbers on the serious accidents, we found the same thing. Now, think about this for a moment. This is a serious accident. This is something with a demonstrated ability to put someone in a hospital for treatment. And 62% of the responses to that was to apply an administrative control. And, one of the least effective controls available. If we add up all the hard controls, elimination, substitution, isolation, and engineering, we basically don't get over 30% for the period of the review. Now, I appreciate there are administrative controls that are needed, that you can't get away from having some administrative controls, but the question is 62% too many? We can also look at this data on a year-by-year basis, and this is from 2011-12 onwards. The orange, the big band in all of those is the administrative controls, and you can see that the top of the yellow band, that's the height of the hard controls. The best year the industry had was the 2016-17 year, where almost 50% of the controls being put in place after serious accidents were hard in nature. But as you can see from that, for every year after that, the percentage of hard controls applied in the industry is decreasing. Now, if we think about HROs, that the whole focus on the failures rather than success is about identifying what's going wrong, where is it going wrong, and then closing that loop with an effective control to make sure that nobody else can be injured by it. I think the industry has a lot to ask itself: is there an over-reliance on administrative controls? And I think there is. When I present this and talk to people about it, you get a range of reactions, but one of the most common is, that doesn't surprise me at all, Sean. You know, we write procedures to solve all our problems. One person said very cynically to me that, he said, if you want to see how many incidents a mine has had, go and check how thick their procedures book is. The thicker it is, the more incidents they've had on the mine. And this is not really protecting anyone. The more procedures we accumulate, the more there is for people to read and remember, the easier it is for these controls to become more ineffective. So I don't think it's surprising that we see that ineffective controls is at 45% in what is causing serious accidents. People have said to me, yeah, but Sean, there's lots of different types of administrative controls you could put in. And what we did was, in the data that was submitted to the regulator, there's a description of the control that was put in place. And we were able to build some word clouds about that. And word clouds are really just a visual representation of all the different words that appear. So we took all of the serious accident data, we took all of the administrative controls put in place after them, and we ran a word cloud on it. And the way to read a word cloud, if you're not familiar, is this tells you the words that are commonly used and commonly reported to the department in terms of the administrative controls used. And you'll see that the word review, ensure, procedure comes up again and again and again. You even see controls where, you know, people talk about something like, we had a stern talk at the toolbox talk about this. I think the industry has a lot to ask itself in terms of, are we really protecting our people by doing this and generating all this paperwork, or is this just a process of generating paperwork? Are we really protecting people by doing it? So that really is the second takeaway, I would say, from the HROs. Identify the issues before they become problems, put effective controls in place. We're seeing in the serious accident data that both of those things aren't actually taking place in the incidents that we do have, and I would really question the effectiveness of the very high reliance on the industry of bringing in more and more administrative controls when things go wrong. That was all I was going to say formally, and I was going to hand it back over to Herman for the Q&A.
Thanks for that, Sean. Really appreciate the presentation. We have had a number of questions come in, and you'll have to excuse me if it's a little slow because I've got to scroll through the questions. One of the questions that's been asked is in relation to the incident charts that you showed, and it was in relation to why was worker not wearing a seatbelt not captured in the individual column as one of the contributing factors to that accident.
It would depend on which particular incident it was. Let me have a quick
I think from memory it was a vehicle rollover or a bus rollover.
Yeah, so I'll just go back for the slide. Yep. So this one here. Yeah, I think, you know, what we found when we were doing these causal diagrams is that there is some subjectivity to them. There has to be some subjectivity. We tried to keep the physical as physical as we could, and I think for us, you know, you could argue that could go in the individual column. I think I'd be comfortable with it in the individual column or in the physical column there. I think for me it was a physical contributor to the fatality, so it's important to have it there. But yeah, no, I totally take the point. It could go in the individual column.
Yep. Thanks for that, Sean. Another question that's been asked is, do you see a role for continual effectiveness auditing of principal hazard management plans? Specifically relating to the coal mines.
Yeah, I think you just got to keep reviewing them. I mean, that this is a dynamic environment you're in. One of the things I think I noticed is there is and we talk about it in the report, but you definitely see this Newtonian view in mining, that we write procedures and that's how we go and we do things then. And the reality is you're not in a static environment, you're in a very dynamic environment that's changing all the time, and you just have to review all the time. And that's what the HROs spend all their time doing.
Yep. Another question here relates to the findings in the report that industry generally chooses those lower level administrative controls. The question really is, do you have an opinion on how then to encourage those higher order controls rather than the procedural change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something the industry as a whole is just going to have to do. If you're writing down more and more administrative controls, you have to challenge that up the line. If you're further up the line in mining companies, if you're seeing a lot of administrative controls put in place, you have to ask yourself how safe they really are making the mine. I think there has to be a complete attitude change in the industry with respect to administrative controls, and it has to happen at every level. If a mine manager is trying to put in harder controls and they can't get the funding to do that, that's a problem. If funding is available but people are still putting in administrative controls, then that's a problem. So I think it's the whole industry has to look at itself and tackle it at an industry level. Again, one person said to me, they said, you know, if I'm a mine manager and I'm constantly putting up my hand for more money to put in more harder controls, and other mine managers aren't doing that, then, you know, do I look like I'm not doing the work that I need to be doing? I'm not managing it as effectively as I could. So I think there is a real set of hard questions that the whole industry has to ask itself about its use of administrative controls and why there is that over-reliance on it. And I can understand why there is an over-reliance on it. And I think it does come from this paperwork approach, which I think is got to change.
Thanks. Another question here is in relation to the tools that industry uses to investigate and analyse accidents, and there are a number of them out there. And during the review of the investigations, you would have seen different iterations of those. Did you start to form an opinion on whether or not one or another would be better than others, or is it really?
That's a difficult question, and I mean, people like different methodologies for different things. I think you just keep following that chain back to understand what was driving it, and you go as far back as you can, and that's what we tried to do in the causal diagrams. And you know, ICAMS is good, but I think you have to go further. Root cause analysis is good once you don't come away with a couple of root causes or one root cause. You know, that's where it starts to get a little bit tricky. The method you use can't become more important than the answers you're trying to find. And I think in some cases that's what can happen. And I think what we see is when the regulator is giving information to the mines, understanding those organizational aspects of an incident are absolutely critical, because then every mine can say, well, hang on, do we make decisions like that as well? And if we do, is that the right way to go about it?
Yep, thanks for that, Sean. Very quickly, there's a question here. It starts off with a statement, and it's in relation to high reliability organisations, and your presentation seemed to focus on you know, the organisational aspects of a high reliability organisation. But Weck and Sutcliffe also observed that in the culture of high reliability organisations, there's also individuals who are mindful and watchful and have learned to recognise and look for those things that are unexpected. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely critical. And then they got to report them. So you need people keeping their eyes open. You need a reporting system that works and encourages reporting. You need to make sure you don't discourage reporting, which is hard. Companies don't like to see graphs going up, and they like seeing graphs going down. And that's a situation you're going to have to try and deal with to encourage people to report. Then you got to investigate those reports, and then you got to give close the feedback loop to put in a control in place. So through all the levels of the HRO, that's got to be happening in individuals and in the systems and procedures that you have in place to make sure that is happening.
Okay. Another one, do you see administrative controls being action controls? That is, controls that require a worker to know or to do something. How do we then move away from that idea that a worker has to do something to be safe or not safe?
Yeah, I mean, this is really tricky, isn't it? I mean, I think the first question you really come to is all the procedures you write. Do you expect people to retain that? And I think the answer is yes, you do. But I remember one person said to me they were sitting through their own induction and they were bored, but they expected everyone else who was going to sit through that induction to not be bored. Inductions that take days and days and days and days, where you require people to memorize a lot of information. How much of that do we really think people are going to retain when they're actually doing their jobs? So I think you've got to strip away. Procedures have their place. I'm not saying procedures are a problem, but I'm saying too many procedures are a problem. And this is where you get to this concept of in the high reliability organizations of you need to understand how people are actually doing the job. And your procedures should be changing in accordance to how people are doing the jobs, assuming they're safe, not people doing it their own way and keeping it quiet. If people aren't following your procedures, it's probably because you got an issue with the procedures. There's a conflict between using that procedure and getting the job done. Now, I'm not for a moment saying you can do a job in an unsafe manner, but you can do a job in a safe manner with a reasonable amount of procedures and paperwork for someone to be able to work with it. I was talking to someone yesterday and they said it's a really interesting and confronting thing to do, to print out all the procedures for your organization and put them on a table, and then ask yourself just how much of this do you know. We generate paperwork and we think that there's a direct link between that paperwork being generated and it producing a safe outcome, but there's many layers in there that you have to work through.
Another question, do you think the industry could benefit from sharing information around the various hazard controls implemented on each of their sites, procedures, equipment, machinery? Is there an opportunity for better sharing?
Absolutely. I think there is. I think there's, as I say in the report, there's a great opportunity for regulator to share with industry and vice versa. And then even within industry itself, there is a need to pass out all this information that people have to make things safer. The analogy I sometimes talk about is, when a plane crashes, we all, even if we're not in the industry, we all want to understand what happened, and it would just simply not be acceptable for the official accident reports not to be released. It wouldn't be acceptable to us if we felt some airline companies were hiding the truth of what happened. We'd jump up and down. So they demand that transparency, and I think we should be trying to do that in the world of mining as well. The more information we have on what is going wrong, how are people getting hurt, what are the circumstances to people getting hurt, I think that's incredibly powerful. And again, I'd say go and have a look at these causal diagrams, and do a health check in your own organization. Have you missed some of the things that were missed in these incidents as well?
Thank you. There's one here around supervision that they'd like to get your thoughts on. Obviously, it's highlighted as a major contributing factor in the fatalities during that time period. Do you think that this can lead to an over-reliance on supervisors simply ensuring that individuals are doing the right thing, or what they're supposed to be doing, following procedures, appropriately trained and correctly? So the supervisor being the policeman of the administrative control rather than monitoring or looking at hazards and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure the benefit of the policeman will do anything here in the supervisory capacity. I think it really is about working with people about how they're doing the work. Is it safe how they're doing it? And you obviously need someone with the right experience to do that. This was a similar finding to what they found in the WA review some years back. They had data where they were able to look at how long the supervisor had been a supervisor, and they found that incidents, I can't remember off the top of my head, but the incidents were much more likely when you had a supervisor who was in the early years of being a supervisor. This acquired experience and knowledge of how safety works on the ground, that's what you need inside a supervisor's head who is able to help people do their job safely. It's a very complicated problem though. But I think the idea that you can just produce procedures and then you police those procedures, if that really worked, I don't think we'd have incidents. The world is more complicated and a mine site is more complicated than that. And you need someone who can react and understand that on the ground.
Yeah. We've got a question here in relation to the smaller segments of the mining industry, for example, quarrying, where the resources available are somewhat spread thin. Do you think there should be a separation between the business management aspects and the safety management aspects? And that is that the site senior executive should be there purely to manage the safe operation without the distraction of the business aspects.
I'll leave that one for you to answer, Herman. But I think we spoke to quarry people as part of the review, and there's no doubt in my mind that it is different. And running a quarry with 14 people is different than running a big mine with hundreds of people. The tension of paperwork came up with everyone we talked about, but it was really came up when it came to quarries. And a number of quarry people said to us, look, I manage risk by being out there watching how the work is being done and making sure it's being done in a safe way. I can't do that if I'm in here doing a whole pile of paperwork, which is perhaps more appropriate for a large mine with hundreds of people in it. And that tension becomes a real problem. And I think the management of it does become different. But I think it's a subset of the bigger paperwork problem as opposed to necessarily being quarry specific. It just happens that they are smaller, and then the paperwork burden be a bigger issue there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sean. I don't think I could answer that any better than what you just did. Yeah. Another question here is in relation to HROs. Could you share your view on how they budget and fund those higher level safety controls or that safety approach proactively? Have you had an opportunity to look at that, or can you provide some comment on that? No,
I can't provide a huge amount of comment on that. That's something we're starting to work on now going forward. It's the reality, I think, and I can't be more stark about this. There's been 47 fatalities in 20 years in the mining industry. Give or take, the mining industry has largely been doing things the same way for the 20 years. I would say to anyone that if you keep doing what you've been doing, then I don't see the fatalities changing. And when you look at the causal diagrams, I think that becomes reasonably obvious. So something has to change. And this is where you come back to this sort of structural change at every level of, yes, someone's going to have to decide to fund things to do this. There's elements of this that will cost money. There's both in the regulator and in industry. There's cultural changes that have to happen, particularly with respect to reporting and how reporting works. That won't happen if only certain segments in certain companies or only certain companies do this. You need to do it across the board. I think other industries have a closer link with cause and effect, or cost and benefit, shall we say. the airline industries know it's just not good business to have planes crashing, and that makes people nervous to fly, and that affects business. I think one of the challenges for the mining industry is that we can have fatalities and incidents, but people still buy gold and still buy mobile phones. There's not that direct cost benefit link. But I think there is a groundswell in the industry to try and change this. And I hope there's a groundswell to try and change this. And I think with the HRO path, you've got the ability to do that. But it's going to take all levels from the CEO all the way down to the coalface to make a difference here.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. There's certainly still some ongoing interest around supervision. A question here is, would you have any recommendations on how to address, or perhaps, bring about some change in that supervision area?
I mean, I think, it's a difficult question. And the reality is, there's lots of people listening who'll know the answer better than me, but it's not a challenge that this industry is going through alone. I think in other industries, in engineering and that, for example, we're having similar challenges. And to me, the supervision is about having people who understand risk in a genuine sense, still retained in the company in that position, and being able to make a difference, and supported in the right way. I think it becomes very difficult if you have a supervisor who's been asked to enforce a set of procedures that maybe clash with the ability to get the work done effectively, or clash with clash with how people want to do the work. And if that supervisor isn't given support to change those procedures where it's appropriate, or simplify them, or change how they work, then that's going to be very hard for that supervisor to manage that situation. So I think you're back to this multi-level question of the support has to come from above and below, and you need to retain people in the industry who have the knowledge, who have the experience out there to be able to do it. And that was one of the things that came up when we talked to mines, that there's a feeling there's a huge amount of new people coming into the mining industry, which is not a problem in and of itself. The problem is if the supervision isn't taking place, because there simply is not enough supervisors there, because they've left, and I think that becomes a big issue to try and have to deal with. If you're getting that turnover of people, how do you as an industry try and tackle that? How do you try and stop that happening? You got to retain that experience.
Yeah. A question here around administrative controls is, do you think that the main driver for utilising those administrative controls by the business is in some way an attempt to meet the legislative requirements, to be able to demonstrate that they've complied or are complying?
Yeah, I think there's a few aspects to this. I think yes is the simple answer on there's no doubt there's an element of that happening. There are other aspects though that I think are really important in there as well. I think cost is another. It's very easy to apply an administrative control at minimal cost, and I think habit is probably the bigger one. I mean, I don't think anyone, or very few people, when they're trying to respond to an incident, they sit down and move through the hierarchy of controls. I think the default, and this is from talking to people, is the default is you just, we need to change the procedure. That's simply what we do. And until people are honest about that process, and are willing to change that process, I think there'll always be difficulties in reducing the number of administrative controls that are applied.
Yeah. A question here is, what are the next steps for the findings as a collective industry? So the report made a number of findings. What are the next steps? I can certainly speak to the findings in relation to those about the regulator. I know we're moving to focus on serious accidents. We're building systems to improve our reporting. So we're addressing those recommendations. Partially, the answer here also is these workshops and seminars, but interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and I think it's part of it is discussing, arguing about these findings. I think is very important. I think part of it is taking these findings and saying, do they apply to our specific operation? Have we got some easy wins here in terms of what we can fix? I think reporting culture is a critical thing that has to change from an industry perspective, and obviously the regulator has a role in that, because I think the reporting system is just complicated and awkward at the moment, as I say in the report. But when there's a more streamlined reporting process in there, where it's not an administrative burden to report an incident, I think that will be a big change. But there's the mechanics of that, which is one part, and then the other part of that, which is just as important, is actually getting people to report. And when you talk to organizations, it's a very hard thing to do, and people aren't quite sure how to go about it. So yeah, the reporting is critical. The use of administrative controls is critical. The reliance on paperwork is critical. There's no one shot here. It's got to take a whole range of approaches. And I've been saying to the industry side as well that it's not just data that needs to go to the regulator and needs to be analysed, but the industry has a whole ability to collate their data to pick trends, hopefully pick trends before they become a problem in the industry. But if there's no sharing, then that's not really, you're going to lose a big advantage there, and you're basically leaving it in the hands of the regulator to spot those trends. And I'd much rather see both the regulator and industry spotting those trends. I mean, the good news is that there's nothing particularly new about HROs. They've been around for a long time. There's been a huge amount of research done on them. There's huge practical examples of how they were implemented. There's a lot of information on the specific challenges you encounter when you're trying to do them. So this is a totally doable thing in my head, but the industry has to be willing to believe it is a critical thing to do. Fundamentally, I believe if you don't do it, then the fatalities we've seen over the last 20 years are just going to keep happening.
Yep. A question again around supervision. Do you see or consider there is a need to improve the competencies, the qualifications, the experience levels of supervisors as a way or a method of getting better supervision?
Again, I leave this one up to you, Herman, for that. I think the problem is, as I said earlier, the problem is supervision. It's not supervisors. How do you improve supervision? That's the key challenge. When you look at the fatalities where supervision was absent or inadequate, it's very sobering. It's a very sobering read, and I think a lot of it is not necessarily relatively simple to solve. It's not, but I think we sort of know what we need to do. We need to capture and keep that experience there. We need a way of ensuring the supervisors are able to know the hazards that are there, know how to work with them, and that they're getting support from above to be able to manage it in the way they need to manage it. That to me is the key, and really what we're talking about here is this Newtonian and complex view of the world of mining. I think there is this Newtonian view, which is that you manage down, you write procedures to get things done, and that when something goes wrong, it must be because someone hadn't followed the procedure. The reality is these mining operations are incredibly complex. There's interactions no one thought there, and you have to be willing to have a very dynamic approach to that paperwork and how it works. If someone wants to change a procedure and it takes 4 weeks to do it, pretty soon people stop reporting changes they want to do to procedures. You have to be able to turn those things around really quickly. The same as if you want to encourage people to report hazards, but you're putting in more and more administrative controls in response to that hazards, that's a pretty big disincentive for people to report more hazards, just so that more paperwork and more procedures can be given back to them.
Yep. Thank you, Sean. And probably a final question that we've got, it's a comment, Sean, it's an excellent report. How does industry make that next step change or paradigm shift required to move away from a 20-year-old mindset to develop a safety culture that is more aware, that HRO type approach?
Well, it's as I said, there's a huge amount of information out there in terms of how you develop a HRO. And they really center on those 5 aspects of HROs. What I would suggest you do if you're a mining company, and we've got some presentations coming up with this next month, is that you ask yourself how far away, we know what a HRO is, it's in the literature. How far away are you as an organization from HRO status? This report is useful because it tells you what the gap is from an industry level between where you are and where you would want to be, and just pick one of those areas. Pick administrative controls first, pick training first. How many people are operating something or in an area of the mine in which they were not specifically trained to be? Pick supervision. Just pick one of those areas and start to make it better.
Yep. All right. Thank you, Sean. That's the end of the time that we've got for the questions. For those people that typed questions we didn't get a chance to answer, I'm sorry about that, but I did try and sort of bundle up as many as I could. I'd like to thank Dr. Sean Brady for the presentation, and I'd also like to thank all of you for attending and participating. I think at one stage we were up to 281 participants, which is quite an excellent turnout, and certainly shows how interested people in the industry are in the report and the recommendations, and perhaps how and where we can move forward as an industry to reduce that rate of fatalities and serious accidents. With that, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.